years ago, the Supreme Court decided that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was no longer necessary because we've already dealt with discrimination and we don't have to worry about local election boards or anything like that messing with minorities' rights to vote. However, since that law has been undone by the Supreme Court, it seems that there are various situations in southern states that make it more and more difficult for minorities, specifically black voters, to go out there and cast a ballot. So there are examples of cities moving their polling places, closing down their DMVs so people can't register to vote. And of course, these DMVs are located in predominantly black neighborhoods.
What a wild coincidence.
There's also redistricting to basically dilute, I should say, the black vote. So I'm going to give you the latest example as reported by the New York Times, and it should make you angry if you believe in democracy. So apparently there is an issue happening in Sparta, Georgia, which is an area that's predominantly black, right? And here's what the New York Times found. The majority white Hancock County Board of Elections and Registration was systematically questioning the registrations of more than 180 black Sparta citizens, a fifth of the city's registered voters, by dispatching deputies with summonses commanding them to appear in person to prove their residence or lose their voting rights. So understand what's happening in Sparta. First of all, the black community there is disproportionately targeted by police, right? They get arrested at a much higher rate than white residents. So they're already very scared of cops. Like they don't trust them. But cops will show up to their door and issue summonses indicating that, hey, you know what, we find you suspicious. There's a possibility that you're not eligible to vote. So you have to show up to court and prove that you're eligible to vote.
And you have to prove where you live. Well, you showed up at my house, so apparently you know where I live.
Yep. Yes. So what ends up happening is people get incredibly discouraged and they don't show up to court. They're like, whatever, I won't vote. So that was a huge problem, and now there's a lawsuit against that election board, elections and registration board, to figure out, whether there was any wrongdoing.
But and I'm sure they do it in the white areas just as much, don't they?
They do not.
Oh,
which is interesting. Now, some might argue, whatever, this is an isolated incident, doesn't prove anything, it doesn't prove a widespread problem. However, there are other instances that I'll get to in just a second. But first, the board's aim, a lawsuit later claimed, was to give an edge to white candidates in Sparta's municipal elections. And that November, a white mayoral candidate won a narrow victory.
It makes all the difference, of course.
Yeah.
A lot of these elections are super tight. They know what they're doing. Paul Weyrich, one of the founding fathers of the conservative movement in America, said, we don't want everybody to vote. We only want our people to vote. So of course we're going to try to narrow the vote.
Also, put all of this in context, guys, because remember, one of the biggest stories from the last presidential election in 2012 was that Republicans were making this big deal about voter fraud, right? There were virtually no instances of voter fraud. There was no prevalence of voter fraud, but they wanted to pass these laws that would make it increasingly difficult for people who typically vote for Democrat candidates to go out there and cast their ballot. So one thing that they did was, the voter IDs, which sounds easy. Like, yeah, if you want to vote, just have an ID, except it disproportionately impacts students and elderly people. A lot of elderly people don't have a driver's license, so they're unable to vote if you pass those types of laws. Also, think of the number of students who travel out of state for college, right? And so if you don't have the right ID, you wouldn't be able to vote in that state. So those types of things were going to make it more difficult. Luckily, the Republicans didn't get away with that, but now, because of the way the Supreme Court ruled on the Voting Rights Act, they're getting their way in certain municipalities.
And it's not just students and elderly. 25% of African Americans don't have a picture ID. So a lot of folks live in cities, and so they don't need to drive, so they never got a driver's license. They take the subway, they take the bus, etc. And so that fact is not lost on the Republicans. So they think, great, if I require you to have a photo ID and 25% of African Americans who usually vote against me can't vote, I win. Now, that's anti-democratic democracy. Who cares? No, I just want to win. So I'll pretend there's voter fraud and then create an anti-democratic system on a mass scale.
Yes, and that's exactly what's happening. So one thing that the Voting Rights Act did was it made different cities or local entities get something known as pre-clearance. So if they're going to make any changes to voting, let's say shutting down DMVs or redistricting and doing things like that, they had to get a pre-clearance to prove that they weren't, disenfranchising certain voters. But because the Supreme Court voted the way it did, they no longer have to get that pre-clearance. Let me give you some more examples. The local voting changes have often gone unnoticed and unchallenged. A June survey by the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund found that governments in 6 former pre-clearance states have closed registration or polling places, making it harder for minorities to vote. Local jurisdictions in 6 more redrew districts or changed election rules in ways that diluted minority votes. Alabama moved last year to close 31 driver's license offices, almost all in rural areas with large African American populations, as a cost-saving measure. After lawsuit threats and complaints that the closings would severely curtail local voter registration, the state chose to open the offices at least 1 day a month.
So let's break that down. Two things about that. One, they say, what's the big deal? Just go get a photo ID. Just go to your local DMV and get one. Oh, psych. We closed down all the DMVs near black people. Now you're going to have to drive a further distance. You're going to have to pay more. It's going to be a giant inconvenience. You might have to take a day off from work. You're going to lose even more money. Poll tax is unconstitutional. That says anything that makes you pay money to vote is unconstitutional. So in essence, what they're doing here is a new form of poll tax. I'm going to make all these things cost money, and you're going to have to do that. That way, less poor people vote, less African Americans vote, all the people who would vote against Republicans. Now, the pre-clearance thing, I know that's a little complicated. If you've never heard of it before, the reason that those localities had to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department in order to change their voting laws is because they had a proven record of discriminating against African Americans. A lot of them are in the South, not all, but a lot of them for over 100 years said all these laws to make sure African Americans couldn't vote. So what we had done in the Voting Rights Act is, hey, if you're going to do those kind of laws, you've got to clear it with the Justice Department first. And so if the Justice Department looks at it and goes, no, you're doing it again, this is obviously an end around to make sure blacks don't vote, which is what you've been doing for the last 100 years. We're not going to allow it. Now, the argument of the Republicans was, oh, we don't need those anymore. Racism is dead.
Yeah, that's right.
And the Supreme Court said, oh, you're right. Racism is gone. You don't need those pre-clearance anymore. Just change the law any way you like. Now, guess what happened? They started changing the law to discriminate against African Americans the minute they had an opportunity to do so. What happened? I thought racism was gone. I thought we didn't need pre-clearance anymore. And all of a sudden, it looks like, yeah, when you get a chance, boom, you're back to your old tricks. And we've seen these tricks in the South before. And the whole point is to make sure you don't have power, you can't participate in democracy, and that you're not the equal of other voters in that area.